Welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the policy, people, and politics that animate Texas. Brian is not with us today. He is on assignment covering Spice World, which, as we know, is not the tech convention, but actually the Spice Girls reunion tour. Instead, I'm joined by Andrew Brown. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Derek.
So, gotta ask, since obviously Brian, he's not actually at Spice World or the reunion tour, to my knowledge. But let me ask you, because we usually like to start off with something a little lighter before we get into these heady topics. So let me ask you, who is your favorite Spice Girl and why?
I was a Ginger Spice guy. Just, a
Hmm.
little bit out of the ordinary. Kind of didn't freak me out like Scary did.
I mean, that's kind of on brand for her, though.
Right.
Yeah. So here's an interesting thing as a Ginger Spice guy. Do you know she's currently married to the team principal of F1's racing Red Bull team, right? And so would that make you like a Max Verstappen fan, or are you kind of staying out of that particular melee?
I'm staying out of that one. I mean, is the other one still married to David Beckham?
Yes, correct.
And is he still able to walk?
Yeah, actually, no, because remember, he is the principal owner of Miami
Inter
FC.
Miami, yeah.
Yeah, they're right. Inter Miami, they're correct. Who just signed Messi, and I don't know. I've caught a couple of their games. I think this Messi kid might have a future in the game.
I didn't really know of him. I mean, I heard buzz, like there was this young Argentinian kid that was like making waves. I mean, he might have a future.
Yeah, it's funny we call him a kid, but he's like our age.
Older than us.
Yeah, exactly. A long illustrious career. But obviously, Andrew, we appreciate you coming in, visiting. A lot of stuff to talk about specifically in your particular lane. But before we do, since we haven't had you on this particular show before, let's get some introductions out of the way. So let's start off with basically how you ended up at TPPF. So Andrew, life before TPPF, go.
Yeah, so grew up in Texas. I went to Baylor for undergrad and Southern Methodist University for law school. And it was during my time in law school that I really got keyed into my subject matter area, which is the child welfare system. Our law school had a child advocacy clinic. I had some family connections with adoption that was going on at the time. And it just really felt like that was the lane that I wanted to be in for my legal career. So after law school, moved up to the Washington, D.C. area and went in-house for an adoption and foster care agency there. So I was living in D.C. but not working in politics, which is kind of a rare thing to happen in that town.
So where were you a barista?
Where was I? Not that Starbucks, man. They burn their beans.
More of a Pret guy?
I'm much more of a Pret. Sometimes
Understood.
Pete's.
Understood.
Yeah. But while I was there, I got more and more involved in the policy side of things, and then had an opportunity to go work for another organization very similar to TPPF to start up a child welfare policy shop, which I'm not sure if the listeners are aware, but not a lot of conservatives in child welfare.
No.
It's very much a field where people like to use their pronouns. And so having a conservative voice in child welfare policy was something that I was really excited about. I thought was really important for us as a movement. And it was through that work that I got connected with TPPF and my predecessor here, who was doing the same thing that I was doing at the time, building a conservative voice within the child welfare system. And so after he took another opportunity, he called me up and I was able to come over and join the TPPF team. And then as I've been here since 2018, you let people know that you're interested in various things and you start getting more and more responsibilities. And that's how I came to be assistant to the regional manager.
Nice. If I can yes and your point, and let's not let the Office reference go unacknowledged. But if I can acknowledge your other point, the one you said about building a conservative voice for, child welfare, it bears mentioning that, you, when you were at the previous organization or currently, aren't the only right of center voice there. The problem is, and at least in my experience, what I've observed, is that the other voices in this space on, quote unquote, our side of the aisle tend to draw from the worst side from the other side of the aisle. And when I say that, I mean in terms of remedies and solutions.
Right.
That it basically is, what can we do to ensure that we snatch more babies?
Right.
And that does not seem like a very productive place to start any discussion. Obviously, with child welfare, we all understand these are tough circumstances. These are situations where, families might be struggling and individuals and families might be struggling with addiction. Mm-hmm. They might have other sort of criminality. But it's almost like the hair trigger response is to grab the kid and then pull them into the state.
Right.
That seems a little misguided. Can you kind of clarify that particular lens through which we view child welfare?
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. One of the things that has driven me crazy over the years as a conservative in this space is talking to other conservative folks who maybe aren't steeped in the issue, and it's that gut reaction. And I completely understand that gut reaction. If you hear about child abuse, neglect, those types of things, what you see in the news media is the most horrific stories possible. Right. And yeah, absolutely, get in there, protect those kids. But when you actually get into the field itself, you realize
things are
the things that make the headlines are the vast minority of these cases, right? Most of these kids are coming from poor families that are trying to do their best under hard circumstances and need support from their local communities rather than government intervention. And when you get into that level of the system and you hear people saying, well, the biggest problem is we just need to get these kids adopted into better families. As a conservative, it drives me nuts because I'm like, we're for small government except for this. And we want more government intervention in what is probably one of the most horrific things that government can do to a citizen. And by that, I mean permanently separate you from your own child and take that legal relationship completely away. And so our approach on this is we want to get to these root causes. We want government intervention to be a true last resort. We want the government to step in legitimately when a child has been abused, when they're in imminent danger of harm. That's where the system should be operating. Everything else needs to be support through local community organizations, and rebuilding that civil society that we really have been losing in this country. And I think the current state of the child welfare system is exhibit A of why we need to rebuild civil society in this country.
Yeah, and that's, it's a point we bring up frequently, especially when we talk about, civics education. It's like we can add another module to the TEKS. We can do X, we can do Y in the policy space. But, when are we done spitting into the wind because of all these countervailing cultural forces? But strong families, as you remark, are one of the bulwarks, one of the buttresses against kind of the societal decay, as you and I would deem it.
Right, and I would say government can do very little to build strong families. They can do a lot to weaken families.
Yeah, we should pass a law that just families need to be strong. So to pass a law, there ought to be a law. But so you came to TPPF, obviously. Love to have you here. But we after you got here in 2018, I think it was 2020, we really segued into kind of the campaign model,
right? Where
you had previously been the director of the Center for Families and Children, our child welfare center, back when we were kind of in that siloed capacity. You've really kind of brought in to include everything else in that child welfare space, and we'll talk a little bit about SB 14 here shortly. But I really want to kind of, what is your animating principle up at the building? Because look, you're talking to lawmakers. Some may have some experience with child welfare, whether they themselves are foster parents or know foster parents that they've interacted with, have constituents that talk to them about it. But the thing is, and look, I'm the vice president of policy at a think tank that does a lot of child welfare. Even I don't know the vast majority of what you know in this area. So how do you educate the folks up at the building who this would be a secondary or tertiary area of interest?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one of the biggest challenges that we have because this is a very niche subject matter area. It's a hard subject matter area to be in. Your
job is safe if you feel like that's what you're buttressing right now. So,
but it's understandable that not a lot of members want to become an expert in this because you're having to look at really terrible, heartbreaking cases.
Yeah.
Constantly, every single day. And so one of our big goals is just that education component. We do a Child Welfare 101 briefing for staff at the beginning of session, and it's that 30,000 foot level. This is going to come up at some point, and here's the basics that you need to know to be able to advise your boss. And the way we do that is it's a very general, I will say, I'm just going to give you the facts, and when I editorialize and give you my opinion, I'm going to make sure you know that this is my opinion of the system, not the way the system itself is structured to work legally. And I think that's really important that you have those two perspectives. Now, where we come in is, here's how the system is currently working. Here's the data that shows this is not working well. we really bolster that data with stories. There's nothing more powerful in that building than impacted families coming in and telling their stories of how the system has actually affected their day-to-day lives. Because other than that, they're just a number, and your gut instinct is to err on the side of caution in this field. And even if it seems like there might be a problem through the data, until you actually see the real-world impact of that problem, it's going to be a little bit harder to act and to make that change. And so that's one of the bridges that we try to, one of the connections we try to make for the members up there is the data and the stories.
Well, and that's a perfect encapsulation of what it means to approach something from a conservative mindset. We don't talk about, there are no cases in which removal is necessary, or, almost all cases removal is necessary. It's all about trade-offs, right? And that's, we would not be a center-right organization if we did not discuss trade-offs specifically in the policy space. So, again, like you mentioned earlier, you got caught doing your job well, so we punished you by giving you another one.
Throw me into that briar patch.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so you were the Associate Vice President of Policy, a role that you've held for about how long now?
A little over a year. I think coming up on 2.
I was about to say we were so young and innocent back, a year ago. So, a year ago, that was actually, 3 or 4 years ago, it seems.
I had hair back then.
Yeah. As long as there's nobody doing any sort of internet sleuthing, yes, I can concur. Yeah, as long as there's no follow-up questions. But we've moved you into this new role, one in which the foundation has benefited greatly from your service in that role as the Associate Vice President of Policy, because you are, when it comes to the personnel management side, kind of the really looking at some of the supporting documentation of some of this legislation. You've just been absolutely killing it. We definitely appreciate it. What does your role entail here? Keep it 30,000 foot. We don't need to talk about, on, Thursday I have to fill out the weekly report and, stuff like that. But 30,000 foot, what does your new role entail? And how does that kind of, I would say, support what you're doing with your continued role with Right for Families?
Yeah. Well, as the Associate Vice President of Policy, one of my duties is to ensure that your lunch is well prepared every day.
Thank you.
That your shirts are properly starched. It's taken me a long time, but I feel like I've gotten the right amount of starch in the shirt.
I feel like I gotta apologize. When I threw coffee in your face and said I don't have time for you, that was on me.
It's all right.
I may have overreacted.
I deserved it. I came in without knocking. That's my fault.
That is true. That is true.
But in all seriousness, a lot of my role is to advise and support all of the experts that we have here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation to execute on their visions. It's really a cool thing to be at this organization because we have the smartest people in the state in their fields working here. And in my role as Associate Vice President of Policy, I get to help them take their big ideas and turn them into actionable policy solutions and help them sell those ideas at the legislature. One of the big things that came out of the last legislative session that we're working on right now is really understanding how the rules of the House and the Senate actually can impact legislation. We've all known for a long time that the parliamentarians do have a certain amount of power. They've got quite a bit of power, as it turns out, with several bills that went down this last session on procedural grounds. Now, for those who may not know, House parliamentarians and Senate parliamentarians, and we focus on the House because the Senate just doesn't have rules. They have rules, but they kind of throw them out the window as convenient.
No, I wouldn't say that. It's a matter of course is that they suspend the rules at the beginning of every day.
Yeah, exactly.
I do have to mention that was something that Secretary Nelson said to me once. He goes, Derek, we have plenty of rules in the Senate, some of which we very, very much cherish, and then we suspend them. So, I had to chuckle at that.
Which is very accurate. Yeah. But essentially, what that parliamentarian does is they make sure that the House and the Senate run by agreed upon rules that the members vote on at the beginning of every session. And those rules really dictate even the way a bill is structured, how much information can be in a bill, the way that it's communicated. We want to make sure that there's a level playing field for all of the members and all of the pieces of legislation that come through the chambers from a rules standpoint. The politics is a different story. But what that means is bills can be killed if they don't follow these very minute, sometimes arcane procedural rules. If there's like a little detail missing, that bill can die just because of a procedural defect rather than anything having to do with the merits of the bill. And we saw that happen several times during the last session, and it made us realize, we really need to build up our understanding of that process, our understanding of those rules, to be able to more successfully navigate through the legislature during a session. So that's one thing that I'm working on right now, is building out that capability within TPPF. You and I have both enrolled in parliamentarian training.
We're Badgers now.
I feel we are Badgers, University of Wisconsin, baby. That felt bad. That felt really bad.
Imagine being a Big Ten fan, man.
It's worse for you.
Yeah.
It's much worse for you.
Yeah.
But I say all of that to make this point that doing this job well and making sure that we are serving the people of Texas well, requires constant training, constant education, and a constant awareness of where do our most effective capabilities lie. And I think the campaign model that we've set up has really enabled us to do that here at the foundation, because we're able to draw on the strengths of each member of this team and deploy those in the right direction to be as effective as we possibly can.
If I may yes and that point, because it's a fantastic point, is that not only do you take greatest advantage of the people that are on your team, people are forced to have a diverse team at the table, whether it's folks from engagement, comms, whatever, whether it's Brian in the meeting or one of his team members, it's somebody that knows more about comms than you or me or any other of the people on the policy side, which we say, glowingly. But yeah, so I definitely reinforce that point. That is a fantastic model. Now let's actually talk about one of the bills that did, I would say, end up running afoul, or at least being adjudged to have run afoul of certain parliamentary procedures. SB 14, the ban on the so-called gender-affirming care or child mutilation, however you wish to term it, is law now. It's been law for about a week.
It is. Went into effect on September 1st.
Yeah, among many other things, including the fully operational Death Star. But yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the subject matter area, our involvement going forward, because this has been painted as a social issue,
right?
Which I think kind of takes it out of the actual milieu that it was in, which was that child welfare space, if we remember. We'll get to that. So before we dive in on that, let me just get a level set on what was the national policy discussion in Texas and nationally prior to 2023.
This issue really tipped into the national consciousness within the last 1 to 2 years, maybe. It was something that was bubbling under the surface for a number of years, but it really didn't get to the point of everybody fully understanding what was actually going on. These pediatric gender clinics have not been around all that long in the United States. I think the first one opened in Boston in 2007. So it's a relatively recent phenomenon of medically transitioning children who are struggling with a mental health disorder known as gender dysphoria, where they feel that they are a sex other than their biological sex, and that causes them very intense anxiety, depression, and distress. It's a diagnosable mental health condition. Now, what's been interesting with the rise of social media is you're actually seeing more and more children having gender confusion, but not full gender dysphoria. And a lot of that, we theorize, is based on the dramatic increase in social media use and the communities that have popped up on the internet and within the various social media websites, as well as some of the cyberbullying and just all of the things that kids are having to deal with these days. I kind of grew up in that weird generation that we started analog. I remember using the card catalog at the library at school, and then all of a sudden computers popped up.
To be fair, you also went to Baylor, though.
That is true. That is true. We actually went horse and buggies, and the females were not allowed to wear dresses that did not cover their arms, neck, and down to their ankles.
This was in 2000, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. There was a fun... when did I get to Baylor? I got to Baylor in 2003. 3 was my freshman year, and they had this is a true story, they had just permitted dancing like less than a decade prior on campus.
I never knew Waco was kind of that footloose place.
Oh, it was. Yeah. I lived in the footloose town. Nice. And then Chip and JoJo came and everything shiplapped. How did we get onto that topic?
I don't know. Now we just got to go home and watch Footloose.
Now back to child sex trait modification.
Yes.
This issue, people started understanding more and more what kids were going through on the internet. I brought up the card catalog, and I was saying, I wouldn't want to be a kid in these days.
Absolutely.
Because what they're exposed to, the way that bullying occurs is just so dark and nefarious.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, bullying was you got beat up on the playground, a teacher saw it. It was very much out in the open.
But it ended when the school day ended. And there were, outlets and protections. Now it's essentially psychological torture that goes on. And yeah, it's no wonder that many of these kids are just looking for acceptance anywhere they possibly can and are so vulnerable to being sucked into this ideology that says if you physically alter your appearance, you will be happy, finally. And what we're learning very, very quickly is that's not the case. The other piece we realize, or what we have come to learn in the last several years, is there are doctors and pharmaceutical companies who are making a lot of money exploiting these mental health disorders. And for us, that was the animating principle behind Senate Bill 14 was who's the real villain here that we need to be fighting? And it was very, very clear that the true villain are these radical activists and these radical doctors, and I'm going to use that term loosely, because they are... Dr. Moreau was a doctor.
Dr. Moreau, Dr. Mengele, also a doctor. But they're violating that first duty, which is to do no harm. And they are actively harming these children based solely on an ideology.
And that's where the tie-in with the child welfare happened.
Exactly. And so once the general public became aware of these medical experiments that are being conducted on children, there was understandably and rightfully an outrage and, a call for these kids to be protected. And what do you do when you need to protect a kid? You call CPS. And so that was the visceral gut reaction is, this is child abuse, this is child abuse, this is child abuse, which, yes.
Very understandable.
Right. But when you say that, you have to understand that that term has legal ramifications, both for that child and for their family. Yeah. And you have to figure out is going that far, is using that nuclear option of pulling a child away from their family, putting them into the foster care system that we know already has its own harms and trauma that it delivers on children. Is that the right way and the best way to protect these kids who we know are already struggling with a very significant mental health disorder?
And to put just an underline under that, what you're saying is you're basically saying that, look, we can put gender dysphoria, gender confusion aside.
Right.
We have a kid who has very acute anxiety, maybe perhaps some depression, the things that are, major red flags for youth mental health. And the solution then to some folks is then to thrust these individuals into a system that almost unequivocally exacerbates those particular negative functions.
Right.
And
that's not a product of an intent. I don't think
absolutely.
The intention is to protect. And again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier is when you understand a system from a 30,000 foot level, you don't understand what goes on inside that system. And you're not expected to. And that's, where folks like me come in who have been doing this for their entire career is, hey, FYI, here's all of the horrible things that's going to happen to this kid when you put them into this system.
And so it's just a struggle to talk about because you definitely have, these folks who I would say there's definitely a lot of energy, a lot of, fervor behind it because they see what's being done to kids in the name of this ideology that's been around for 5 minutes. And, this is irreversible. This is irreversible across the board because at the very least, even if you're engaging in the lightest treatment possible, and I'm not even talking, I'm talking the lightest treatment pursuant to SB 14. I'm not talking about therapy or anything like that, which therapy can go either way. It can kind of exacerbate the delusion or it can work towards normalcy. But essentially, any of the interventions countenanced by SB 14 are irreversible. And essentially, a child is now being pushed down this, without any consent of their own. Now, look, they turn 18 and, their body, they can do whatever they want to it. Right. Piercings, tattoos, the whole 9 yards. And that would include, double mastectomies for conforming reasons. Mm-hmm. I understand the animating principle behind it. My question to you is, what do you think is the best way of explaining to these people who are well-meaning that the child welfare system is A, not equipped for this, to say the least, and B, an inappropriate venue even if it were?
Right. So I went about that in two ways. One was I got to know kids who had transitioned and then detransitioned and heard from them.
Having watched into hearing, I hear those kids don't even exist.
I can tell you they very much exist, and they're some of the bravest kids I've ever met in my life.
You wouldn't know it by what some of the folks on the left said.
You wouldn't. But what we're doing is we're coming after a sacred cow for the left. It's one of the ways that they're trying to further divide children from their families so that they can indoctrinate these children and make them good little comrades. But it was talking to those detransitioners as well as talking to the parents of children who have struggled with gender dysphoria regardless of whether or not their child transitioned or not. And you realize that the munchie mom, the mom who sees her transgender child as the accessory that gives her credibility in Austin or LA cocktail parties, is again the vast minority of the parents of these kids.
It's just a parent wanting their child to stop hurting.
Correct. And this child is struggling with a mental health disorder and the parent wants to help. So they take the child to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist from the very first appointment, without ever spending more than an hour with the kid, says, "Oh yes, your child is transgender. And the best thing that you can do is affirm them and take them to this other doctor who will give them these medications. And oh, by the way, if you don't do this, your child will kill themselves." What parent is not going to at least be tempted to follow that advice? Right. If you don't have a strong moral or ethical foundation or even a spiritual foundation, it's very, very easy to be persuaded by somebody who you believe to be an expert and believe to be doing having your child's best interest at heart, is telling you, you need to take this radical step or your child is going to die. Right. And that's where we really came down to this idea of who's the real villain here. And the real villain is the person who's emotionally manipulating a family and emotionally manipulating a child into getting experimental, irreversible medical procedures performed on them.
And, obviously the work that you've done in that space has been, if I might say, has been one that's very people-centric and compassion-oriented, which I think that there's a lot of folk who do engage in discussion around any policy area that tend to forget that even if we have this fundamental disagreement, that we all have an intrinsic humanity that we need to respect. Now, should that humanity be permitted to, experiment on children? Absolutely not. Right. But that's what the political process is for. Of course, the activists say, oh, well, we're going to leave the state of Texas. Of course, I'm very dubious of that, specifically because if people actually made good on such threats, Canada would be twice the population of the U.S. after the Bush presidency, for all the people that said that. But that being said, we're now starting to see that also with in higher education. I think there was a study out a day or two ago that says about 2/3 of respondents from Texas basically would tell colleagues not to take positions here, specifically because of SB 17 and 18, the anti-DEI bill and the anti-tenure, the 5-year tenure review bill. And essentially, they're saying, oh, well, we don't want to have other colleagues come here because of the political state of higher education, which, of course, coming from the conservative side and who came from higher education, I just can't help but laugh at. But what we're seeing is essentially, now that the vampires are out in the sunlight, is that, if they can't have DEI or, an absolute ironclad job for life guarantee policy, that they just don't want to do the job. And if you look at the, the political affiliations of college faculty, we're talking almost, depending on which measure you use, anywhere from 95 to 99% Democrat, which could be liberal, progressive, or any shade in between.
They're clearly very oppressed in their institutions.
And exactly the ones that they marched through. But that being said, is the reforms that were put in place specifically in 2023 seem to be bearing fruit. And look, I'm not saying that wanting a person, even one who I disagree with vehemently and have in the academic context and in the professional context, wanting to leave the state is per se a good thing, but it shows a change in the incentive structure for these individuals within higher education. Of course, the survey also asks, where are you looking at going? California, New York, and then like distant third, Colorado, which of course I'm like, if that probably belies a little bit more about the individual's priors than does the fact that they're like, oh, their arms are folded. I hate Texas so much, in that particular vein. So let me ask you
I'm looking at the population trends between Texas and those states, and it would seem that not many people are taking their colleagues' advice about not moving to Texas.
Yeah, I was going to say, as a PhD outside of academia, I look at that and go, huh. So, but one thing to say though, is this also brings to light a recent Gallup poll as well. Mm-hmm. The Gallup poll in and of itself found that the faith in higher education in the traditional four-year college experience is absolutely plummeting. We have seen, in 2015, 57% had a lot of confidence in higher education. In 2018, that's down to 48%. Now we're at 36%. And this is across every subgroup. Now, granted, conservatives tend to be further on down that track as that poll shows. But we're seeing this entire shift away from higher education, and it's very understandable. The actual premium that a college degree has completely disappeared from black college graduates born 1980 or later.
Right.
So let me say that again. If you were black and born 1980 or later, the value of a college degree, the premium over making what you would make if you did a trade school or any other pursuit on average, is gone.
Right.
It is completely gone, and it disappears faster than it does for white folks. So I completely understand this particular trend, yet it almost seems like anytime you even just, try to pull a diseased leaf off the rotten tree, the tree has, convulses, spasms, and says 2/3 of it want to leave the state. Right. And so my question to you, back when you were at Baylor and looking through your card catalogs, and we're not going to have to talk about what Baylor did this last weekend in football.
Oh my gosh.
When
Painful.
you were but you have that private school, and I would argue on the grand spectrum, conservative private school
for the most part, yeah.
Experience. How was it there? And do you see these trends, specifically the trend of the leftward march to the institutions, happening even there? And what do we do about it?
Yeah, you definitely saw it. Not to the extent that you see it at places like the University of Texas, for example.
Gasp.
And partially that was because you had a very clear Baptist foundation that the board of trustees really did, I thought, a good job of adhering to. Mm-hmm. I didn't see a lot of drift during my time at Baylor. I haven't seen a lot of drift since. Now, granted, I don't watch things as closely as I used to, but you still really did have a strong influence of more progressive ideologies into campus. One of the things, though, that I appreciated, and this could be a generational thing. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting to that age now where it's like back in my day.
Yeah. Tell us about kids these days.
Yeah. But both at Baylor and SMU Law, there was an encouragement of expressing dissenting opinions. Mm-hmm. There was an encouragement to explore all sides of an issue. I think law school is more by virtue of the fact that as a lawyer, you might have to represent somebody that you disagree with, and you need to be prepared to do that. I think at Baylor it was more from a philosophical standpoint, from the history of that school and the thoughts and philosophies that animated that school. I think that is an important factor in the loss of confidence in these institutions of higher education. But I think what's more important is what you pointed out, is that the value of the degree is going down. I think it's, the old James Carville line of, it's the economy stupid, right? People are looking at their higher education degrees, and we were always told the path to a good job, the path to prosperity in America is a college education. You get that college education, you are set for life. You're going to have the American dream, the house, the white picket fence, the beautiful wife, the 2 kids, the nice car in the driveway. Go to college and get that done. It's not the reality.
No.
We're all now realizing we were sold a bill of goods, or, more accurately, the world changed, the economy changed, and what was true for our parents and their parents before them is no longer true in the modern economy. And so, yes, our confidence is dropping in these institutions because the institutions aren't changing with the world. They are really insulated in a lot of ways from the impacts of the global economy and the realities of the job market because they have endowments. They have donors.
They can suck money literally right from the ground.
They can suck money literally right from the ground. They're able to pull down federal grants. Their existence is not dependent upon economic forces. If it were, I don't think you would see this DEI, all of these ideologies. I mean, you probably still have it just because the type of person who becomes a PhD
I resemble that
is a
remark.
little bit squishy, shall we say.
I'm right here, dude.
But I don't think you would see it to that same extent because the institutions themselves would have to respond to market forces and those demands of actually getting our students into well-paying jobs and giving them a return on their investment.
And that's what you see, with the papers and specifically the research trajectory of Dr. Gillen on our staff is essentially not saying, oh, college is for nobody and everybody should learn how to weld or code or whatever the case might be, but saying like, look, there is a lot of inter-major variability with how much the earning potential for that major is. And therefore, should we start looking at finding what gives that pathway? And, look, if for doctors and lawyers, if they're going to be making X amount of dollars, taking out a more substantial debt might make perfect sense. But look, if you, have advanced underwater basket weaving as your particular major and you rack up $150,000 in debt on that, are you going to weave enough underwater baskets to actually make good on that? And the data suggests that absolutely is not the case. So I really appreciate you bringing up that asymmetry right there. This is the time where Brian would start getting the little hook and trying to drag me because the guy is...
but he's not here, so we're going to go. Welcome to the special 3-hour edition.
the Derek Rogan experience. There we go. Only a couple more things I wanted to talk about specifically in the state here. One of which being that we had a lot of people don't know this, but we had a pretty close call last night on the grid.
We did.
Reported. Oh, I should add, only reported. It was talked about by many people, but it was only reported. When I talk about straight down the middle reporting by friend of the pod, Brad Johnson. Shout out, Brad. Essentially, like close to 8 last night. ERCOT issued an EEA2, an energy emergency alert level 2, where it's, level 1 is like, hey guys, knock it off with all the demand. Level 2 is like, hey, we really mean it. And level 3, of course, being where we actually start having we're
going to start shutting your lights off.
Yeah, exactly. So this happened, like I said, around 7:30. And what we saw was a precipitous drop in the grid frequency. So in other words, the amount of, available power on the grid took those surplus levels down to really close to the demand levels. And when that happens, obviously, why did it happen? If you look at the time of day, sun's got to set eventually. So obviously solar doesn't do terribly well at night. Wind, of course, though, at that same time dropped off. Now, we're still talking like we had almost 70, during this tough period. 70% being carried by natural gas, about 15% by coal and lignite. And so basically, it put the onus. Now, obviously, natural gas is a cleaner technology than in years past. But everyone that hates their coal and all that, the onus was basically on coal to bail out the megawatts left on the table from wind and solar. So one of the things that I think is what's coming to a head in the policy discussion, and feel free to push back, disagree, even though I don't think you will because you've seen the same discussions I've seen, is there's a growing antipathy, not towards renewables per se, but to have them actually carry a big chunk of that base load when they are inherently non-dispatchable. Is that kind of what you're seeing up at the legislature, and where do you kind of see this I would say policy realm drifting to?
Yeah, I definitely see it up at the legislature. What more importantly, I'm actually seeing it now from the general population. And strangely enough, I was driving into work this morning listening to the radio, and I guess the station that I was using pulls their news from CBS. And they were making that point. Like what we would consider the, left of center, liberal media is saying, well, and part of the problem is we didn't have solar and we didn't have wind producing like it needed to be producing, and that's what caused this. That's a dramatic shift because, around the time of Winter Storm Uri and when the grid became a huge topic of conversation, all of the left's talking points were, we need more wind, we need more solar. It's not the wind and solar. That's not the problem. That's not the problem. That's not the problem. This has gone on long enough to where they can't even say that with a straight face anymore. They have to say, yeah, the wind and solar is kind of a problem.
And I think, I'm surprised Jason Isaac hasn't burst through this door and said they're called unreliables. And so, but he makes a very, very good point on that, because if you look at the Texas energy market, so we're a completely deregulated market, several tiers when it comes to production, distribution, so on and so forth. The problem, of course, being is that we actually have a good market.
Right.
We don't have what they have in many of the other areas, which is a capacity market.
Right.
And so that being said, the actual spot price on a kilowatt of energy has a lot of say in what happens in that market.
Yeah.
So, and here's where I think the inherent advantage of wind and solar, and this is not an endorsement for that, because obviously I think we've established that we're skeptical of the intermittency of it. But they say, look, it's free. The wind blows for free. The sun shines for free. Why shouldn't we be capitalizing it? And that's fine. The problem is that it's not dispatchable. And they go, oh, well, just build more batteries. Currently right now, the state has like a complete storage capacity, like under megawatts, right? And don't get me wrong, we're talking in the, 80,000 range when we're talking about like where the ERCOT, the general baseline. But the thing is, it's like, even if these batteries were topped off, like, look at like what a power wall setup looks like in someone's house if they have solar and are using that to offset, say, their pull from whatever the common utility is. We're talking their entire garage wall basically being used as a very expensive battery. Now, until every single house does that, it's not going to be a remarkable decrease in that particular demand side, right?
Right.
And so my question then to you is, obviously we can build more. You can build more coal and lignite plants, even though I think that's kind of a bit going out of style in this. Obviously, we have no problem with natural gas here in Texas.
Not at all.
But that being said, is what we need is some new power options to complement, some new dispatchable power options, allow me to qualify, to complement our already existing thermal fleet. Let me ask you, what do you think about nuclear?
Big fan.
Big fan?
I am a big fan of nuclear. I think we are way behind the times right now. And I think for understandable reasons. You had noted, tragedies, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, right, that have spooked the public.
Though I will say, 3 Mile Island was what was supposed to happen.
That's true.
Yeah, they actually got that offline.
Yeah,
so
that is true. But you have those 3 things loom large in the public's mind, right? Even if you weren't around for those incidents, you know about those 3 nuclear incidents. There's only 3 that we can really point to in the history of doing nuclear power. And I think it's time, and I'm sensing a shift in the public's perception of nuclear power right now, of being more open to it and understandable that, the technology is to the point where this is safe, this is reliable, and this can be something that dramatically reduces the cost of energy to the consumer if you can get it built to scale and online. It's a lot of upfront investment, but that's an investment that I think is worth it, and it's more worth it to me than wind, solar, and all of these other pie in the sky type of renewable sources of energy, because nuclear is always going to be working. It's not going to just stop when the sun goes down.
Or at least natural gas, coal, the normal thermal dispatchables.
Right.
When there's going to be a planned outage, ERCOT already knows about it. They're going to price or put it into the model.
Right.
They're going to see that pricing reflected in the other producers who might need to ramp up or choose to ramp up capacity. And so, again, it's the stability
it is
that I think a lot of folks disagree with. And so, yes, we are approaching time, so I just want to hit this last topic with you. Yesterday, there was a ruling that came down from interestingly enough, a Reagan-appointed judge.
Yeah, that was wild.
Well, I mean, I always like to point out that, Reagan did give us Scalia and Rehnquist, but he also gave us Kennedy and, now this guy. But no, this guy was a federal judge in Hawaii, I believe. Now is just kind of helping out with the federal caseload in West Texas, and essentially enjoined Abbott, saying that hey, you got to get the granted we haven't had a boat come through in God knows how long, but it's a navigable waterway, so get your wipeout obstacles out of the Rio Grande, and I think he gave them till about a week from
15th,
now.
I think.
Yeah, a week from now to comply. So we've obviously talked, till we're blue in the face on this particular thing. And as far as needing approval from the Army Corps of Engineers, legally having read into that particular case and that ruling, I'm not sure that ruling's in error. Now, look, we can talk about the wisdom of, whether we're talking WOTUS or any of these other federal regulatory apparatus, but I think that's a relatively straightforward reading of the law in this difficult circumstance. So, as the buoy barrier, easy to say, was essentially deployed, and of course, the left media, but I repeat myself, went ahead and ran with it. That it's basically got spikes on it. It's got buzzsaw blades. Even though
it's like they're apparently Greg Abbott is Jigsaw.
Yeah.
This is this elaborate saw murder machine.
I was about to say that it was I say that needlessly complex. But if you look at they actually had videos of the guy just leaning up against the saw with his hand, and it coming back with not even marks on it.
Right.
And again, is to dissuade folks from trying to climb over. One of the issues. So we talked ad nauseum on this show about the abdication of the federal government, which I think is old hat by now.
Right.
The question this raises is the buoys themselves were actually deployed, and this is what the Abbott team says, and I'm 100% inclined to believe, because it makes perfect sense. And again, it's not stopping illegal immigrants from coming over. It's channeling them to the ports of entry,
correct,
where they can safely cross a bridge. Abbott caught some flack and some praise from folks on the right saying you can't drown on a bridge, and so this was to dissuade the illegal between port crossings, right? And so the federal government, by pulling this out, is essentially saying, you know what, fine. Wade in there, kids get washed down the river, which has happened numerous times. We've seen children abandoned, a whole parade of evils there. Essentially, now we're basically reopening this method of coming into the country that does have a mortality percentage.
Yes.
My question is, one, humanitarianly speaking, if that's a word, how does the federal government even square that? And two, what's the alternative solution? And three, look, if these folks are going to come here and claim asylum, the easiest way to do so is through the ports of entry. So why are we avoiding that?
Right. And I think one thing to keep in mind is this ruling will be appealed.
Oh, it already is. It already is. Yeah.
This is not the end of this case. And I kind of liked the state of Texas's chances going up. It'll be some novel questions about the federal government abdicating its responsibilities to secure the international borders. And what roles do those states have, and what recourse do those states have that have an international border to secure their own territory and their own sovereignty. I think the humanitarian issue of this is the part that really gets my blood boiling. Obviously, I'm a child welfare guy. I understand folks coming from many of these countries in Central and South America who just want a better life for their kids.
Absolutely.
And they're desperate to get here. And those folks are being placed in harm's way. Those kids are being placed in harm's way.
They're being forced into an economic arrangement with a criminal syndicate.
Absolutely. And that criminal syndicate, they don't care what happens once they get to the river. All they have to do is deliver them to the crossing point. Once they're across, okay, fine. They got paid, right? They made their money, and the cargo has been dropped off on the beach. To me, that's the real tragedy of this, is we are giving those cartels more ways of making money. We're giving them more options to smuggle human beings across a border and to put human beings at risk for their very lives for a profit. It's disgusting, and it's something that if you are somebody who thinks the Buoy barrier was somehow this dastardly, evil, brutal thing, but you're not willing to speak up about the cartels smuggling these kids and families across the border and using them as nothing more than livestock to fund their syndicates, you're a hypocrite.
Right.
I'm sorry. You're a hypocrite. And we need to have different ways of ensuring, one, that those who want to come to America can do so and can do so in the legal ways and can claim asylum if they are in fear for their lives back in their home countries. By that same token, we also need to make it exceedingly difficult for criminal cartels to exploit those people. And we need to hold those criminal cartels accountable by any means necessary.
Right. And I think that you hit the nail right on the head, because so much of the debate is not even about these, again, transnational criminal syndicates. Let's call it what it is. But so much of the debate around this is these people, much like you said, these people are looking for a better life. I will stipulate to that. I completely agree with that. And I would like to see them, especially the ones with justiciable asylum claims, be afforded that. The problem, of course, is that our immigration system has been completely broken for some time. And again, going back many administrations. It's such a politically toxic area because, nobody wants to sit at the table because there's no trust in the other bargaining entity. And so that's why we get into this place of near federal paralysis. And I think paralysis implies that there isn't intent there, and I'm not willing to say that. But at the very least, we know nothing is happening because there's absolutely no willingness to do things at the federal level. I mean, I've on this show have praised Abbott for his willingness and to be novel solutions on this particular front. But again, it doesn't staunch the flow. It doesn't necessarily, and not only that, but we're just talking about stopping the bleeding. What do we do about the millions upon millions of folk that are already here? That is something we're going to have to get into at another time. But Andrew, really liked having you on. Hopefully we can have you back with Brian. I unfortunately was not able to find a zip-up vest that I could have used in time, but I would like to say you're welcome back anytime.
Appreciate
now, I do have to actually mention, because Brian would have my head if he didn't, that his newsletter product, The Post. You can go to texaspolicy.com and you can subscribe to that or any of our other communications product. And that brings us to the end here for The Right Idea. So as Sam Houston says, do good and risk the consequences.